So, of course, like I mentioned, all this was compounded by the fact that social services, which would once have been available to people when there were economic slowdowns, were also becoming underfunded. And so this was typical. Pensioners getting paid 3 months late, state hospitals and clinics charging for services and therapies. And all this meant that people had to rely more and more on family and other social networks. Now, luckily in Central Asia, these remained relatively strong and broader, wider than in other parts of the former Soviet Union. For example, mahalas could be mobilized to help feed a single mother's 4 children. But unluckily, social networks have frequently been stretched thin. The roots of societies changed as a result of economic migration. Women would become head of households as men, fathers, became rarely seen because they went off in search of work. Often they would go to Korea or they would go to Russia. I have a friend from Uzbekistan who went to Moscow to work. Then he went to Kazakhstan to work, and then now he's all over the place working. So money may be coming in, remittances from abroad, but the social structure is altered. And Russian networks tend to be much weaker as well, ethnic Russian networks, particularly when family has traveled abroad back to Russia. But again, this goes back to the reference point. Bad compared to what? People compensate. Some do it by eating bread. Others do it by bringing the farms to the cities. I remember in Tashkent, all of our neighbors had roosters and chickens. There were a couple bulls that chased our dog. Two bulls in our neighborhood that threatened poor little Sabaka. Lots of sheep everywhere. People use alternative fuels. They burn coal, wood to heat their home or to cook, right? They often work several jobs. There's no such thing as a car, for example, that isn't also a taxi. People collect rents from their normal jobs. Rents are unearned income. So teachers, for example, accept gifts for additional services like getting a good grade. Traffic cops are really the best at this. There are collective groups that pool their money together as a way of a sort of survival mechanism. I made a bunch of friends in a library where I was doing research every day for a few months, and the library women told me how they would pool their money. They would put in some portion of their salary every month and give it to one person on a rotating basis, so that person could make a larger purchase that month. For example, they could buy a jacket or shoes for their kids or something. And then often people would emigrate. Oh, sorry, I meant to put this up here a few minutes ago. People would emigrate and they would send money home. So the hopelessness was based on these social networks that were stretching thin. It could be tempered or it could be furthered by the reference point. Where are we looking to? What do we want to be like? What don't we want to be like? And the availability of compensation mechanisms. So how did people react to this hopelessness? In much of Central Europe, the alternative either took the form of the old regime now playing the new one, now playing the new rules of the game, for example, really going democratic, or populist or nationalist. So a lot of the communist parties in Central Europe became really legitimate social democratic parties. They wanted power, but they all played by the rules of the new game. They became Democrats. In some places, especially Yugoslavia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, you had many who turned populist and nationalist, extreme nationalism, radical nationalism. But almost all were democratically elected and played by the rules of the game. To a certain degree. There were competitive authoritarian regimes further down south when we talk about Yugoslavia. But most of the populists and nationalists in Central Europe played by the rules of the new game. Now, what's interesting in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan in particular, is that here you saw a return to the old order as well. But since there were already members of the old elites in power, this return to the old regime focused on the mechanisms of power. So instead of ejecting those responsible for reforms, as they did in much of Eastern Europe, but something that wasn't possible in Central Asia, where old elites manipulated the elections, the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs agreed to eject democratic mechanisms that they blamed for the situation. They demanded greater authority for the leaders, those who began or didn't begin the reforms. This was expressed in referendums. For example, for president, for constitutions. This was expressed in elections. Blame democracy for the transition gap. That's what you had where you had more liberal regimes, like in Kazakhstan. You blame the lower levels for corruption in the more authoritarian states, like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. After a decade, there was really little room to maneuver, and these old elites were very firmly ensconced in their states. In the mid-2000s, people began looking higher up. They began looking higher up. They didn't just blame those lower down for their problems. And that's when you see harsher tactics being used by the regimes facing a legitimacy crisis. You had a revolution of sorts in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, which we'll talk about. You had the shooting of demonstrators in Andijan in Uzbekistan in that same period. And here you move the conversation back to the reference point. That's what you saw in all these Central Asian states. Hey, we don't want to live like they do in Afghanistan. And so we need to maintain a strong amount of control. All these things have made a move closer to the old empire more appealing for Central Asian elites. And we'll talk about this in the next lecture when we get to foreign policy. So in the second decade after independence, things changed a little. The Kazakhs and Turkmen did best, thanks to high oil and gas prices. Compared to Uzbekistan, which had led the first decade, Kazakhstan had the higher per capita income, and the gap in overall economic size increased substantially after 2000. So Kazakhstan was really leading Uzbekistan in the second decade after independence for the first time ever. And this is something that's generated regional animosity as well. And this plays out in the foreign policy field. I'll update you after we cover all this and once we get to the newest situation, I'll update you on how all the economic developments have taken place. But I just wanted to make this sort of note here so that you know that this plays into regional animosities as well. And so we'll stop there and we'll get into foreign policy next.